Hey, bucket girl, you missed a spot right there. Get down on your knees and do it right, like you always do. The entire gym went dead silent. Marcus Holt, a fifth-degree black belt and the uncrowned king of the Iron Crest Martial Arts Academy, was pointing his finger down at a black woman crouching over a mop near the edge of the octagon. Simone didn't look up right away. She wrung the mop once, slowly, and then stood up straight. She didn't look at Marcus with fear, nor with anger. Her eyes were absolutely still, as if she were staring right through a ghost. Get down and wipe it yourself. No shouting, no hostility. Just a flat, simple counter-command. For a split second, the whole room froze. Then it erupted. Roars of laughter broke out from the bleachers. Phones were whipped out in unison, cameras already rolling. Marcus Holt smirked, spreading his arms wide, playing the villain to perfection. Did this bitch just bark at me? You guys hear that? He stepped closer to Simone, dropping his voice just low enough to stay off the microphones. Get on my mat, bucket girl. I'll let you take the first swing. Consider it overtime. Simone didn't say a word. She ripped off her rubber gloves and slammed them onto the floor. She stepped barefoot onto the canvas. The exact moment her feet touched the mat, her body instinctively dropped into a stance, silent, ancient, and lethal. It was so deeply ingrained in her DNA that the fifth-degree black belt completely failed to sense the oncoming train. By now, 30 phones in the room were already recording. Just 10 seconds later, this clip would break the internet, and the pristine reputation of the uncrowned king Marcus Holt would be officially crushed under the bare feet of a cleaning lady. Laughter rolling from the benches where the advanced students sat. Phones coming out. 2 of the assistant coaches trading looks with raised eyebrows. A 17-year-old kid near the far wall physically covering his mouth. Marcus Holt grinned. He turned to the crowd, arms wide, playing it perfectly. Did she just bark at me? You hear that? Now the dog thinks she lives here too. The laughter got louder. Someone clapped twice. He stepped closer to Simone, close enough that the sweat from his earlier session was something she could smell. He dropped his voice just enough that the people right at the front could still hear it. But the camera phones wouldn't catch it clean. Get on my mat, bucket girl, just for a minute. I'll let you throw first. We'll call it the bonus round. Simone pulled the rubber gloves from her hands. She dropped them on the side of the bucket. She stepped onto the canvas barefoot and settled into a stance so quiet, so ancient, so deeply wired into her body that it looked like nothing at all. Like she'd simply stopped walking. Marcus raised one eyebrow and smirked at the crowd. And then it started. Pay close attention to those rubber gloves on the floor near the bucket. They'll matter again before this story is over. 6 months before that morning, the 5:22 a.m. bus out of West Charlotte smelled the way all early buses smell. Like thermos coffee and plastic seats and the specific exhaustion of people who have been awake before the city admitted it was possible. Simone Caldwell sat near the rear doors, wool hat pulled low, eyes half shut, earbuds delivering something nobody else on that bus would have recognized. She rode this route 6 days a week. Same seat, same silence, same exit at the corner of Brookshire Avenue and Clement Drive, 3 blocks from Iron Crest Combat Academy. The walk to the gym took her past a parking lot that at 5:30 in the morning held exactly 4 cars. By 9 it would hold 40. She knew the makes and models of the regulars by now. The white Range Rover that belonged to Marcus. The silver Audi that belonged to the head instructor, Derek Vaughn. The 2 matching Jeeps owned by the brothers who co-managed the competition team. She went in through the side door, the one without a sign, the janitor's entrance. Inside, Iron Crest was dark and still and smelled like leather and dried sweat and rubber mat, and Simone had learned to love that smell, the way some people love old books. Not because it was pleasant, because it told her she was in the right place. She started with the main training floor. 43 feet by 61 feet of interlocking foam tile that she mopped in a pattern she developed herself, slightly diagonal to the seams, because the angled pass picked up more particulate. She mopped the locker rooms next, then the bathrooms, then the lobby where the trophy case lived under fluorescent light that made the gold look cheap. She restocked hand sanitizer dispensers, wiped down the weight equipment, collected the tape scraps and protein wrapper debris that the fighters scattered like breadcrumbs and never thought to pick up. She scrubbed the toilets. She replaced the paper towel rolls. She hauled the trash bags to the dumpster by the side entrance in 2 trips, because one of the bags was always heavier than it looked. By the time Derek Vaughn arrived at 7:15, the building looked like it had never been touched by human hands. Vaughn would walk through the lobby, check the mat surface with 1 foot, look around once, and move on without saying a word. Not one time in 11 months had he said thank you. Not one time had he said her name. That was fine. Simone wasn't there for the thank yous. There was a notebook she kept in the front pocket of her work vest. Small, the kind that fits in a palm. The cover was dark green, water-stained at the corner. She'd carried a version of this notebook since she was 22 years old. She never wrote anything important in it, just small observations. The way the morning light hit the cage at a particular angle. A technique she noticed during sparring. Something a fighter did with their left shoulder before a cross that told you the cross was coming. She wasn't supposed to be watching the training sessions. She watched anyway. From the supply room doorway, from the hall, from wherever she happened to be when the noise from the mat told her something worth seeing was happening. 11 months at Iron Crest. She had watched over 200 hours of training, and nobody had ever asked what she thought about any of it. Simone Caldwell had not always been invisible. 8 years ago, in a converted warehouse district on the south side of Memphis, Tennessee, there was a circuit that ran without a name, without a license, and without the knowledge of any sanctioned athletic commission in the state. It operated on word of mouth, cash at the door, and a code of silence so absolute that even the fighters' families didn't always know where they went on Saturday nights. The underground. Simone fought her first bout in that warehouse at 24 years old. She had a towel over her shoulder, a mouthguard she'd bought from a sporting goods store for $3.49, and no real expectation of winning. What she had was a trainer named Leonard Hicks, 64 years old, retired Navy, ran a gym out of a converted garage on Beale Street Extension. Leonard had seen her shadowboxing in the parking lot of a laundromat one afternoon, not working out, not warming up, just moving, the way some people hum without knowing they're doing it. And he had stopped his truck and watched for 4 minutes before getting out and asking her name. She won that first fight in what Leonard later described as the cleanest 2 exchanges he had ever personally witnessed. A jab that reset the distance. A right hand that arrived like a door closing. The crowd didn't cheer. They made a sound that wasn't quite anything, a group exhale, the kind that follows something that happened too fast to process properly. After that, she was phantom. Not because anyone gave her the name officially. Just because when people tried to describe what happened in the ring with her, they kept reaching for the same word. Over the next 9 years, Simone Caldwell went 37-0, 37 fights, 0 losses, 26 finishes. She fought women who outweighed her by 25 pounds. Women with Division I wrestling backgrounds, Golden Gloves credentials, judo black belts. She beat them all, not by being faster, not by being stronger, by being unreadable, by making them throw first, every time, and making them pay for it every single time. Leonard taught her that. You are never the aggressor, he said. You are the answer. Let them write the question. Then answer it so clearly that they never want to ask again. Leonard was the only person in Simone's life who had ever looked at her and seen what was actually there. Not what she was wearing, not where she came from, not what the parking lot or the laundromat or the address on her ID said about her, just what was there. On the night of her 37th win, a third-round stoppage against a former world title contender from Houston, who had 10 years on her in professional experience, Leonard had a stroke in the dressing room. He was on the floor before anyone understood what was happening. He was gone before the EMTs reached the building. Simone held his hand for 11 minutes on the concrete floor, while his body went from warm to cold. She had never talked about those 11 minutes to anyone. She thought about them every day. She left Memphis 6 weeks later, one bag, a bus ticket, and a resume that said nothing about 9 years and 37 fights in warehouses that didn't officially exist. Charlotte was random. She'd never had a reason to go there. She went because the bus was leaving. The job at Iron Crest paid $13, $75 an hour, no benefits, no contract, but the building smelled right. The sound from the training floor hit her somewhere low in the chest. And she could stand in that supply closet in the early morning, before anyone arrived. And sometimes for just a few seconds, she would shadow box without meaning to. Jab, slip, check cross, roll, left hook. Her hands still moved the way river water moves around a stone. Automatic. Beautiful. Like something that had always existed and would never fully stop. Then she'd catch herself and pick up the mop. Because Simone Caldwell was not a fighter anymore. She was a janitor. That was the deal she had made with herself. That was how she'd get out of bed every morning. She had the notebook, and she had the work, and she had the gym smell, and she had the early light hitting the cage at that specific angle, and that was going to have to be enough. On her nightstand at home, she kept a photograph face down. An older man, slight, silver-haired, wrapping a young woman's hands in a converted garage. She knew what was on the back without looking. Leonard's handwriting, a little shaky. Promise me you'll pass it on. She had not kept that promise yet. Marcus Holt arrived at Iron Crest every morning at exactly 7:48. You could set a clock by his white Range Rover, swinging into the lot and parking diagonally across 2 spaces, not because there wasn't room, but because Marcus Holt had never been asked to correct it. 26 years old, 6 feet, 1 inch, 193 pounds of ability wrapped in a personality that had been handed so many mirrors that it had forgotten any other surface existed. 5th degree black belt in Krav Maga. 2-time Southeast Regional Submission Grappling Champion. Undefeated in sanctioned competition. 19 wins, 0 losses. His highlight reel had cleared 340,000 views. His social media following had crossed 280,000 the previous month, a fact he had mentioned during warm-up to anyone within earshot. He coached the elite striking program on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. He ran the competition team on weekends. He was the face of Iron Crest Combat Academy. The photo on the front of the website. The name Derek Vaughn mentioned first in every local interview. And Marcus knew it. He held that knowledge in his chest the way some people hold a diagnosis. Constantly aware of it, constantly referencing it, using it to explain every decision he made about every person in every room. His coaching style was clean and precise in technical terms. He was genuinely talented. That was the thing nobody talked about, because it would have complicated the story. Marcus Holt knew how to fight, knew how to teach, and could demonstrate combinations with the kind of controlled athleticism that made students want to absorb everything he was showing them. The problem wasn't the talent. The problem was what he'd built around it. Every class, he positioned himself at the center of the space. Every demonstration ended with a glance at the mirror or at whoever was filming. When a student executed a technique well, he explained it as a function of his teaching. When a student struggled, He explained it as a function of their limitations. The hierarchy was explicit, maintained, and enforced in the small, invisible ways that don't show up on video, but that every person in the room can feel by the end of the first session. At the top, Marcus. Below him, the coaches he approved of. Below them, the students he found promising. Below them, everyone else. And somewhere underneath all of that, invisible, scrubbing, moving through the building like weather, the janitor. The bucket girl. The one whose name Marcus Holt had never once read from the schedule posted in the break room. He called her, "Hey you." He called her bucket girl. He called her nothing. He pointed at water on the mat and looked at her. He pointed at the paper towel dispenser and looked at her. He said things like, "What exactly do we pay you for?" and said them in front of students, and didn't lower his voice. Simone never responded. She nodded, she fixed it, she moved on. Marcus took that silence as data, confirmation of rank. Proof that the order was natural and correct. But there was someone coming to Iron Crest who was not interested in the order. His name was Calvin Reyes, 41 years old. He worked for a talent development organization called Vanguard Combat Group, based out of Raleigh, and he had spent the last 12 years doing one thing specifically: finding fighters in places where nobody was looking. 3 of the women he'd signed were currently ranked in the top 15 of their respective weight classes. One had a world title. Calvin had found all of them in small gyms, regional circuits, underground events, places where the lights were bad and the money was worse, but the talent was the kind you can't manufacture. He cared about exactly one thing when he evaluated a fighter: what they did when the situation was wrong, when they were hurt, when they were losing, when they were rattled. Everything else was packaging. Calvin had a standing relationship with Derek Vaughn. He visited Iron Crest twice a year, watched sessions, talked to coaches, made notes. He arrived this particular Tuesday morning in a rental car and a plain gray quarter zip, carrying a coffee from the gas station down the block. Nobody would have looked twice at him. Simone was in the hallway near the storage room when he came in. He nodded at her. She nodded back. He sat in the observation chairs near the far wall with a small leather notebook, not so different from hers, and watched. The escalation that came first was so small that half the room missed it. Marcus had been running the advanced class through a defensive drill series, calling out combinations and letting the students execute in pairs. He stopped the drill to demonstrate a slipping technique, and, while he was setting up the rep, he noticed a water trail near the edge of the mat. He stepped out of the training area, found Simone in the hallway, and said, loud enough for the students on the near bench to hear, "Do I need to walk you through your actual job responsibilities, or can you handle water? I'd think water would be in your wheelhouse." A couple of students laughed. Simone looked at the water, looked at Marcus, went to get the mop. Marcus shook his head at the students, pointed it at his own temple, then went back to the drill. Calvin Reyes wrote something in his notebook. Nobody noticed. That would have been enough, maybe. A bad morning, a moment that would sit in the stomachs of the people who saw it, and then dissolve, the way those moments usually do when no one names them out loud. But Marcus Holt was in a particular kind of mood that morning. The kind that comes from a string of good weeks. From feeling confirmed in your position. From looking around a room full of people who deferred to you and deciding that deference was your natural right. He'd had that feeling for a while now, and feelings like that need somewhere to go. The second moment was different. It was between classes. The main floor had cleared out, leaving only a few students stretching near the heavy bags and 2 junior coaches reorganizing equipment. Simone was working the far end of the mat with the mop, moving in her diagonal pattern, and Marcus came back through the main doors with his training group from a break, already talking loudly about a sparring session from the previous weekend. He walked through the space she was mopping, without breaking stride, leaving footprints across the section she had just cleaned. She stopped, looked at the prints. He didn't turn around. "Oh, you want me to say excuse me?" He said it over his shoulder without stopping. "You're in the middle of the training floor." Floors. For training. Not for your little art project. One of the junior coaches, a young woman named Becca, who had been at Crest for less than 3 months, stopped reorganizing the equipment she was holding. Her jaw was tight. She didn't say anything. She looked down at the floor. The other junior coach, a man named Davis, who had been there for 2 years, and who had watched Marcus do versions of this since his second week, looked at the middle distance. His hands kept moving. He knew what happened to people who said something. Simone stood with both hands on the mop handle. Still, not trembling, not clenching. She pressed the heel of her thumb against the wood once, and then she went back to work. And that might still have been it. A Tuesday. A bad person doing small bad things to someone they'd decided couldn't fight back. But then came the third moment. And the third moment was not small. Calvin Reyes was still in the observation area when Marcus reconvened the elite session. The advanced students had filed back in, 12 of them, the best Crest had. The ones with regional placements, with real fight records, with the posture of people who had been told they were something. They lined up on the mat the way soldiers line up. Marcus walked the length of them once. "Slow today," he said. "We're doing something different." He turned to the room. "We have a guest observing from Vanguard. Some of you know what that means." The room perked. 12 spines straightened by half an inch. Calvin didn't look up from his notebook. Marcus said, "So today I want to see real performance. Not your training performance, your actual performance. And I want you to think about what that means." He paused. He looked out across the room, and his eyes landed on Simone, who was near the doorway, preparing to start on the lobby. He said, "Some people in this building know their purpose." He let that sit, and some people don't. He looked back at the students. "Let's make sure we're clear about which one we are." The room understood. A few people looked at Simone. A few looked away. Simone didn't move from the doorway. Marcus said, aloud, conversational, as if continuing a thought, "Hey, bucket girl, you can leave. Adults are training." Nobody laughed this time. The silence was worse. Becca, the junior coach near the heavy bags, had her hand pressed flat against her own thigh, so hard her knuckles had turned white. She was 23 years old and owed 3 months of rent on the coaching stipend she got from Crest, and she did not speak. Davis looked at the wall, and his face did something complicated, and then stopped doing it. Calvin Reyes put down his pen. Simone stood in the doorway. Her hands were at her sides. She wasn't looking at Marcus. She was looking at something past him. The cage in the center of the floor, maybe, or the light coming through the high windows, or something else entirely that nobody else in the room could see. Then she said, "I'll finish the lobby," and she turned and walked out. Marcus turned back to the students. "See," he said, "everybody has their place." Nobody agreed out loud. Calvin Reyes stood up, not in a dramatic way, not in the way of someone about to make a speech. He just stood up, walked across the observation area, and stopped at the edge of the mat. He said quietly, "Marcus, do you know who that woman is?" Marcus looked at him with the expression of a person who has never had a question redirected at them before. He said, "She mops the floor." Calvin nodded slowly. He said, "Before today, I was going to recommend 2 of your students to our development pipeline. I want to change that conversation. I'd like you to get her back in here first." Something shifted in the room, invisible but total. The way pressure changes before a storm that you can feel in your teeth before you hear any thunder. Marcus's face went through 3 things in 1 second. He settled on a version of amusement. "Sure," he said. "If you want a demonstration in humility, He raised his voice toward the lobby. "Hey, back in here. The talent scout wants to meet you." Simone came back to the doorway. Calvin said, "Miss Caldwell, I'm sorry for the interruption." The room went still. Marcus said, "You know her name?" Calvin's, "I know more than her name." He reached into the bag at his feet and pulled out a tablet. He turned it around. On the screen was a photograph, grainy, like footage stills often are, taken in bad light in a warehouse somewhere, but clear enough. A woman in a fighting stance in the center of a chalk circle on a concrete floor. The woman was clearly, unmistakably, Simone. Below the image were 3 lines of text. S. Caldwell, Memphis TN Underground Circuit. Record 37026 finishes. Active 2013 to 2022. Known alias, Phantom. The room absorbed this, then Calvin swiped to the next image. And the next, fight footage, slow motion clips. A compilation someone had put together that circulated in certain professional circles, coaches and scouts and matchmakers who paid attention to things that didn't have Instagram accounts. Simone moving through opponents the way water moves through anything. The last clip was the 37th fight. The one from the night Leonard died. Calvin said, 37 professional bouts, 0 losses, against opponents that included 2 former world title contenders, 4 national-level amateur champions, and a woman who went on to win a world title the year after losing to her. He put the tablet down. He was not performing. He was just saying what was in the file. She retired undefeated. She has never been stopped. The 12 advanced students on the mat were not moving. Marcus Holt was not moving either. Calvin looked at him. "And there are videos," he said, "of you calling her Bucket Girl for the last 11 months. Marcus opened his mouth. He said, that's not what that was." Becca made a sound. It was very small. A sound that had been sitting in her throat since the footprints on the clean mat and had finally come out. One of the advanced students, a young man named Joel, who had been at Iron Crest for 4 years, and who had laughed at the Bucket Girl joke in the early days, and who had felt that laugh sitting in his chest ever since, sat down on the bench. Davis, the junior coach who had spent 2 years looking at the middle distance, put the equipment down in his hands, very deliberately, and sat down on the floor. Marcus said she was the one who got on the mat. I invited her, she accepted. That's a fair challenge. There was nothing wrong with. Calvin said, "Marcus, one word, flat." Marcus stopped talking. Calvin turned to Simone. He said, "I came here today to evaluate athletes for our development program. I have a coaching position that has been open for 8 months. It's a head coaching role for our women's developmental division. 6 coaches under her, full salary, benefits, gym access, travel covered for competitions. I was going to take another 3 months to find the right person." He paused. "I found her 11 months ago. She was just mopping someone's floor." Simone's face did not change. She had her hand at her side, the same hand that had been pressing against the mop handle all morning, and she pressed her thumb against her palm once. "Just once," she said. "What do the fighters need?" Calvin said, "Everything Leonard Hicks taught you. Every single thing." The room heard that name, Leonard Hicks, and felt it land in the places where names land when they carry weight. Simone was quiet for a long time. 8 seconds. Maybe 10. The cage in the center of the room caught the afternoon light from the high windows and glowed faintly. Then she said, "When do I start?" But Marcus Holt was not done. He said, with a voice that had an edge of something desperate underneath the confidence, "That's great. That's a great story. But this is my training floor. I didn't authorize any offer being made in my space. And I didn't authorize a conversation that was supposed to be about my athletes getting turned into a recruiting session for the floor lady." The room turned to look at him. He kept going, because Marcus Holt had spent his entire adult life in rooms where keeping his voice up had always worked. where certainty of tone was the same thing as certainty of outcome, he said. I don't care what her record was in some underground warehouse 9 years ago. That doesn't have any bearing on what happens in a sanctioned gym. And frankly, I think this whole thing is out of line. Calvin looked at him for a long moment. Then, he picked up his phone. He made a call, and it lasted 45 seconds, and at the end of it, he said thank you, and put the phone down. He said, Derek Vaughn is on his way in. I called him when you started talking. Marcus said, Derek isn't going to. Derek and I have an understanding. Derek Vaughn walked through the front doors. He was a quiet man, 53. A former fighter himself, the kind of man who had learned through actual consequence to choose his words slowly. He walked through the lobby past the trophy case and into the training floor and looked at the room. He had been running Iron Crest for 19 years. He had built it from a single rental space in a strip mall. He knew every person in the room by name. He looked at Simone. He said, Miss Caldwell, I owe you an apology for what happened in this building under my watch. He said it simply. No performance. Just said it. Then he looked at Marcus. Marcus said, Derek, this is a misunderstanding. Derek said, your contract is on a 3-month review cycle. The next cycle starts Friday. He looked at Calvin. Is there anything Vanguard needs from us today? Calvin said, just her file if you have it. We'll handle the rest from our end. Simone looked at Derek. She said, the students didn't do anything wrong. Derek said, I know. She looked at the 12 students on the mat, the ones who had laughed, the ones who had looked away, the ones who had covered their mouth, named Joel, who was sitting on the bench with his hands between his knees. She said, they can keep training. This isn't about them. She picked up the rubber gloves from near the mop bucket, where she had dropped them when Marcus had called her back into the room. She held them for a moment. Then she set them down on the corner of the bench, neatly, side by side, and she walked out through the front door. Not the side entrance. The front door. What followed Marcus Holt was not simply a termination, though the termination came 2 days later in a meeting with Derek and a Vaughn attorney that lasted 40 minutes. What followed him was the thing that happens when a pattern becomes visible. 3 former assistant coaches contacted Derek within the week after the story circulated through the local fitness community on social media. Not because anyone was organizing them, but because they had all been waiting for something to name. A woman who had coached at Iron Crest for 6 months and left without a listed reason. A male student who had stopped competing after a public dressing down on the mat. A junior instructor who had resigned by text in the middle of a training week and never explained why. Marcus's social media went dark inside 48 hours. His highlight reel stayed up. It wasn't his to take down. He put in applications at 4 other gyms in the Charlotte area. 2 replied. Neither interview moved forward. Nobody could have told you exactly when the word got around. Nobody had organized it. It was just that the Charlotte combat sports community was, in the end, not very large, and not very interested in importing what Iron Crest had been exporting. At the Vanguard Combat Group facility in Raleigh, the women's developmental division had been operating out of a 4,200-square-foot training space in the Depot District for 3 years with rotating coaching staff and inconsistent results. Calvin had known for a year and a half that what the program needed was not another technique specialist. What it needed was someone who understood, in their body and in their history, what it felt like to be the person nobody looked at. Who knew from the inside out what it cost to keep going in the dark? Without an audience, without confirmation, on nothing but a promise you made to someone who was no longer there to receive it. Simone walked into that facility on a Monday in February. She was wearing the same work vest she'd worn at Iron Crest because she hadn't gotten around to replacing it yet. She carried the green notebook in the front pocket. There were 8 women in the developmental program at that point. The youngest was 21. The oldest was 30. They had between them 7 different backgrounds: boxing, judo, wrestling, kickboxing, BJJ. A woman who had grown up doing nothing and had walked in off the street 6 months ago because she had nowhere else to go. 3 of them had been told by coaches elsewhere that they didn't have what it took. 2 of them had been told that by multiple coaches. Simone looked at them for a moment. Then she pulled the green notebook from her pocket and set it on the corner of a bench. She said, "I'm going to tell you something. Leonard Hicks told me 20 years ago in a garage on Beale Street Extension in Memphis, Tennessee. He said, 'You are not the aggressor. You are the answer. Let them write the question. Then answer it so clearly they never want to ask again.'" She picked up a pair of hand wraps from the equipment bin. Started with the thumb loop. 3 passes across the knuckles. Tight between each finger. Wrist lock. The same sequence Leonard had taught her in a parking garage when she was 22 years old. She said, "We're going to start at the beginning, with footwork. Because everything is footwork." She looked at the woman who had walked in off the street 6 months ago and never been given a real foundation. She said, "Come here, let me show you." 8 months after that first session, one woman from the developmental division won her first sanctioned amateur bout by 3rd round TKO. Another placed 2nd in a regional grappling tournament and accepted an offer to compete under a professional banner. A third, the one who had walked in off the street, submitted her opponent in the first round of her amateur debut and sat in the corner afterward and cried, and Simone sat next to her and didn't say a word and didn't look away. At a regional coaches conference in Greensboro that fall, Simone was on a panel about developing fighters from non-traditional backgrounds. Someone in the audience asked her, "What's the most important thing you teach your athletes?" She thought about it for a moment. She said, "That invisible doesn't mean powerless. Those are 2 completely different things, and people confuse them for so long that they start believing they're the same." The moderator asked if she wanted to elaborate. She said, "No." There was one afternoon that November, after the last session had cleared out, and the facility was empty, and the lights over the main floor had that specific quality of late-day November light that falls a certain way through certain windows in certain gyms and doesn't look like anything you can photograph properly. Simone was alone on the floor. She wrapped her hands. Thumb loop, 3 passes, knuckles, fingers, wrist lock, and she stood in front of the heavy bag in the corner, the one with the slight lean that nobody had gotten around to fixing yet. She didn't do a full session. She just stood there for a while with the wrapped hands at her sides. She thought about 11 minutes on a concrete floor in Memphis, about a photograph she kept face down on a nightstand, about a notebook with shaky handwriting on the back of a photo. "Promise me you'll pass it on." She raised her hands, settled into the stance, southpaw, chin down, hands up, and she smiled. Not for the room, not for the cameras. Not for the audience that had watched the Iron Crest video on social media and built a story out of it they could tell at dinner parties. For Leonard. For the promise. For the 8 women who showed up to an empty gym because they had nowhere else to go and found something waiting for them. The phantom was not invisible anymore. She had just been patient. If this story stayed with you, not because of the ending, but because somewhere in it, you recognize someone, maybe yourself, maybe someone you've watched carry more than anyone ever noticed, hit, like so, this reaches someone who needs to hear it today. Share it with someone who's been invisible for too long, and leave a comment. Tell me, have you ever been in that room? Which side were you standing on? I read every single one.